I almost didn't go that day. My sister had asked me to come watch the Founders Parade with her, and I had a dozen excuses ready. The crowds, the noise, the fact that I'd seen the same march 4 years running, and it never changed. But she'd already bought the spot on Aldermere Reach, right up against the brass barrier railing, about 40 feet from the front steps of Harrowfield Palace, and she looked at me the way she looks at me when she already knows I'm going to say yes. So I went. I had my phone out before the first drumbeat. I don't know exactly why I kept filming. The parade was what it always was, the mounted outriders, the colors, the slow ceremonial column of guardsmen in their red tunics and tall black bearskins, rifles at their shoulders, faces like carved stone. I'd filmed it before, but I kept the camera steady, and I kept it pointed at the column, and it turned out that the 22 minutes of footage I shot that afternoon would end up being watched by more people than I will ever meet. What the camera saw, and what I almost missed standing right there beside it, was this. The girl in the wheelchair was already at the barrier when we arrived. She was sitting to my right, maybe 6 feet from me, with a woman I took to be her grandmother standing behind the chair with both hands on the grips. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. She was small in the way that stops you, the kind of small that makes a child look fragile even when she's smiling, and she was smiling. She had a pale blue cap pulled down over her head, the kind of cap you see on children who've lost their hair, and in her lap she held a piece of paper folded in half. I noticed the paper, but I didn't think much about it. I assumed it was a program. Kids always carry things. The column came up the reach in the middle of the afternoon, under a sky that couldn't decide between gray and white, and the crowd pushed forward against the barriers the way crowds do. My sister got her photos. I kept filming. The guardsmen moved in the way they always move, not quite like men walking, more like a single mechanism, each boot striking the cobblestones at the exact same moment as every other boot. The rifles perfectly level, the chins up, the eyes forward. There's something in that uniformity that stays with you after the parade has passed. It's not military precision for its own sake. It's a statement. Nothing you do will move us. We are the line. We hold. The column drew level with our section of the barrier. The crowd was loud. There were people cheering, holding up phones, a couple of children waving flags on sticks. The girl in the wheelchair didn't wave a flag. She did something quieter than that. She unfolded the paper in her lap. I caught it on the edge of my frame and I almost panned away. I'm glad I didn't. It was a drawing. She'd drawn it herself, in colored pencil, from what I could see. A figure in red, with a tall black hat, standing very straight, with the careful, earnest lines of a child who had worked at it. She'd drawn the guardsman. She'd drawn him exactly as she saw him, upright, formal, immovable. And then she'd extended her arm past the railing as far as she could reach, holding the drawing out to the column as it passed, and she'd looked up. The guardsman who drew level with her in that moment was a tall man, broad-shouldered in his dress uniform, the bearskin adding another foot to his height. His face was what their faces always are during the march, a surface without expression, eyes tracking straight ahead, the jaw set. He was the fourth man in the outer file, and I had been filming him for the last 30 seconds without any particular reason, the way you sometimes fix on one figure in a group. He saw her. I know he saw her because of what his eyes did. They didn't move much. A degree, maybe 2, the smallest possible drop in his line of sight, just long enough to take in the outstretched arm, the drawing, the pale blue cap. Then they went back to the forward position. But in that fraction of a second, something changed in his face that I can only describe as a crack in the stone. Not emotion, exactly. Something older than emotion. A recognition. His pace broke. It was almost nothing. Half a step, maybe less. If you watch the footage and you know where to look, you can see it. The slight mistiming between his left boot and the boot of the man beside him, there for one stride and then corrected. Anyone not looking for it would have missed it entirely. I nearly missed it, and I was watching. He marched past her. The column moved forward. The girl lowered her arm, slowly, and folded the drawing back into her lap. Her grandmother patted her shoulder once. The crowd noise didn't change. People were still cheering. Flags were still waving, because nobody around us had noticed any of it. I kept filming. And then, maybe 15 feet past her position, the guardsman stopped. He didn't break into sudden motion. He didn't turn sharply. He came to a halt the way a man stops when he's made a decision he's been carrying for a long time, which is to say quietly and with absolute certainty. He stood still for one beat, long enough that the 2 men behind him had to adjust to avoid, stepping into him, and then he turned, stepped out of the file, and walked back along the edge of the column to where she was sitting. The noise dropped before he reached her. I don't know how to explain that. The crowd had been loud, and then, as people began to understand what they were seeing, it wasn't. No announcement, no signal, just the slow collapse of sound from the front of that section of the barrier backward, person by person, as each person realized that one of the red-coated figures had peeled away from the column and was walking toward a child in a wheelchair. He reached the barrier. He stood in front of her for a moment, this enormous figure in full dress uniform with the tall bearskin and the brass buttons and the white gloves, and then he went down on one knee on the cobblestones. He held out both hands, palms up, the way you do when you're asking someone to give you something. She put the drawing in his hands. He looked at it for a long moment, both gloved hands completely still, holding the colored pencil drawing of himself, the careful red tunic, the careful tall black hat. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that costs him nothing and means everything, and then he folded it exactly as she had folded it and placed it carefully inside his tunic, close against his chest. Then he reached out and took her hand. He held it in both of his for a count of 5 seconds. I know it was 5 seconds because I counted it afterward, watching the footage. It felt much longer standing there. His face, for those 5 seconds, was not the face from the march. It was something underneath that face, quieter, older, more open. The girl said something to him. I couldn't hear what it was over the crowd noise, but I could see her lips move, and I could see him nod. Once, slowly, the way you nod when someone has said something true. Then he rose. He straightened his tunic. He turned and walked back to the end of the column, found his place, came back to attention, and continued the march. The crowd was completely silent for about 10 seconds after he rejoined the column. And then, starting somewhere to my left and spreading the way applause spreads when it's real, not polite, not reflexive, but coming from somewhere underneath the ribs, the reach broke into the loudest sound I have ever heard at a public event in my life. I was crying. I don't apologize for that. I found out afterward, through people who knew the protocol and were willing to explain it, that what he had done carried a formal consequence. Leaving the column during a ceremonial march is a breach of parade discipline. There is a process for it. His sergeant, who had been positioned at the far end of the street and had watched the entire thing, filed a report. The report was reviewed by his commanding officer. The commanding officer closed the report without action. I still have the 22 minutes of footage. Most of it is the ordinary parade, the mounted outriders, the drums, the ceremonial colors. About 4 minutes of it is what I've just described to you. I have watched those 4 minutes more times than I can count, and every time I reach the moment when he goes down on one knee on the cobblestones of Aldermere Reach, I think the same thing. 12 years of standing still so that one moment of moving would mean something. That's what discipline is for.